The humid Mississippi air hung thick over Magnolia Grove Plantation on that sweltering August night in 1855. In the cramped quarters behind the main house, where the enslaved families lived in wooden shacks barely fit for animals, a woman named Sarah gripped the rough-hewn bedpost as labor pains racked her body. The midwife, an elderly woman called Mama Ruth, had delivered dozens of babies in these quarters, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to happen. "Push now, child," Mama Ruth whispered, her weathered hands steady despite the trembling in her voice. Almost there. Sarah's screams echoed through the thin walls, mixing with the distant sound of crickets and the ever-present hum of mosquitoes. The other women in the quarters had gathered outside, as was tradition, waiting to welcome another soul into their harsh world. They expected to hear the sharp cry of a newborn, that first declaration of life that every baby made upon entering the world. But when the child finally emerged, slippery and covered in blood, the quarters fell into an eerie silence. The baby boy was perfectly formed, 10 fingers, 10 toes, breathing steadily, but his lips remained sealed. His eyes, dark and alert, stared up at Mama Ruth with an intensity that made her hands shake. She had seen many things in her 70 years, but never had she delivered a child who didn't cry. "What's wrong with him?" Sarah gasped, struggling to sit up despite her exhaustion. "Why ain't he crying?" Mama Ruth cleaned the baby with trembling fingers, checking his airways, tapping his feet, even pinching his tiny arm. Nothing. The child simply watched her with those unnaturally calm eyes, his breathing steady and quiet. I don't rightly know," Mama Ruth admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's breathing fine, seems healthy as can be, but..." Outside, the women began to murmur among themselves. In their experience, a baby who didn't cry was a baby who wouldn't live long. It was an omen, they said, a sign that something wasn't right with the child's spirit. Sarah reached for her son with shaking arms, pulling him to her chest. The baby latched onto her breast immediately, feeding with the same eerie silence that had marked his birth. As she looked down at his face, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Even as he fed, his eyes remained open, staring up at her with an awareness that seemed far too old for a newborn. "What we gonna call him?" Mama Ruth asked, trying to break the oppressive silence that had settled over the room. Sarah thought for a moment, studying her son's face. There was something about his stillness, his quiet strength, that reminded her of the deep, silent waters of the Mississippi River that bordered the plantation. "Silas," she whispered. "His name is Silas." As if responding to his name, the baby's eyes shifted to meet his mother's gaze directly. For a moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw something flicker in those dark depths. Not the innocent confusion of a newborn, but something deeper, older, and infinitely more disturbing. Word of the silent birth spread quickly through the slave quarters. By morning, everyone knew about Sarah's boy who wouldn't cry. Some of the older folks whispered that it was a blessing, that perhaps God had given them a child who couldn't be broken by the horrors of plantation life. Others crossed themselves and muttered about curses and dark omens. Master Cornelius Whitmore, the plantation owner, heard about the strange birth from his overseer, a cruel man named Jeremiah Pike. Whitmore was a practical man who cared little for the superstitions of his slaves, but Pike seemed genuinely unsettled by the reports. "Never seen anything like it, sir," Pike said, removing his hat as he stood in Whitmore's study. "The women are all spooked. Some are saying the child ain't natural." Whitmore looked up from his ledger, where he was calculating the potential value of his newest piece of property. "Nonsense, Pike. A baby is a baby. If he's healthy, he'll work. If he's not, we'll deal with it accordingly." But even as he spoke, Whitmore felt a strange chill run down his spine. He had been born and raised on this plantation, had seen hundreds of slave children come into the world, and he had never heard of one who didn't cry. It was unnatural. As the days passed, Silas continued to confound everyone around him. He fed normally, slept peacefully, and grew at a healthy rate. But he never made a sound. Not a whimper, not a gurgle, not even the soft cooing that most babies made. When other children cried from hunger or discomfort, Silas would simply lie still, his dark eyes taking in everything around him with that same unsettling awareness. The silence was so complete, so absolute, that it began to affect everyone in the quarters. Conversations became hushed when Silas was present. Children would stop their games and stare at him with a mixture of fascination and fear. Even the adults found themselves speaking in whispers around the baby, as if his silence demanded reverence. Sarah tried to convince herself that her son was simply a quiet child, that there was nothing wrong with him. But late at night, when she held him close and felt his steady breathing against her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was different about Silas. It wasn't just that he didn't cry, it was as if he understood something about the world that the rest of them didn't, something that made tears unnecessary. As autumn approached and Silas grew stronger, the whispers in the quarters grew louder. Some said he was blessed, chosen by God to endure what others could not. Others believed he was cursed, marked by something dark and terrible. But all agreed on one thing: Silas was unlike any child they had ever seen. And in the big house, Master Whitmore found himself thinking more and more about the silent baby in the quarters, wondering what kind of man such a child would grow up to be, and whether his unusual nature would prove to be a blessing or a curse for Magnolia Grove Plantation. 3 months had passed since Silas's birth, and his continued silence had become the source of increasing unease throughout Magnolia Grove. Master Whitmore, despite his initial dismissal of the slaves' concerns, found himself unable to ignore the growing tension in the quarters. Productivity had begun to suffer as the enslaved workers became increasingly distracted by whispered conversations about the silent child. More troubling still were the reports from Jeremiah Pike. The overseer, a man not easily rattled, had begun to avoid the section of the quarters where Sarah and Silas lived. He claimed the baby's stare made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't explain why. "It's like he's looking right through you," Pike had told Whitmore just that morning. "Like he knows things a baby shouldn't know." Whitmore had finally decided to take action. If there was something medically wrong with the child, it needed to be addressed. A sick slave was a worthless slave, and he couldn't afford to have his property compromised by superstition and fear. Dr. Edmund Hartwell arrived at Magnolia Grove on a crisp October morning, his black medical bag in hand and his expression skeptical. He was a man of science, educated at Harvard Medical School, and he had little patience for the folk beliefs of rural Mississippi. He had been summoned to examine what Whitmore described as an unusual infant, though the plantation owner had been vague about the specific nature of the problem. "I assure you, Mr. Whitmore, Dr. Hartwell said as they walked toward the slave quarters, "Whatever ailment this child may have, there is undoubtedly a rational medical explanation. The human body is a complex machine, but it operates according to predictable principles." Whitmore nodded, though he couldn't shake his own growing unease about the situation. "I hope you're right, Doctor. The situation has become quite disruptive to the normal operations of the plantation." As they approached Sarah's cabin, they could see a small crowd of enslaved people gathered at a respectful distance. The moment they spotted the white men approaching, they quickly dispersed. But not before Dr. Hartwell caught sight of the fear in their eyes. Inside the cramped cabin, Sarah sat on her narrow bed, holding Silas against her chest. The baby, now 3 months old, had grown considerably, but remained as silent as the day he was born. His dark eyes tracked the movement of the 2 white men as they entered, and Dr. Hartwell felt an unexpected chill run down his spine. "This is the child?" he asked, setting down his medical bag and approaching slowly. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is Silas." Dr. Hartwell extended his hands. "May I examine him?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, her protective instincts warring with her knowledge that she had no choice in the matter. Reluctantly, she handed her son to the doctor. The moment Dr. Hartwell took the baby in his arms, he understood why the slaves were so unsettled. Silas didn't react to being handled by a stranger. No crying, no fussing, not even the typical startled response most infants displayed. Instead, he simply stared up at the doctor with those impossibly calm, dark eyes. "Remarkable," Dr. Hartwell murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. He began his examination, checking the baby's reflexes, examining his throat and airways, testing his responses to various stimuli. Everything appeared normal. More than normal, in fact. The child seemed exceptionally healthy and alert. "Has he ever made any sound at all?" the doctor asked Sarah. "No, sir. Not since the day he was born. Not a cry, not a whimper, nothing." Dr. Hartwell frowned, gently pinching the baby's arm to test his pain response. Most infants would cry immediately, but Silas simply turned his head to look at the spot where he had been pinched, his expression unchanged. "Extraordinary," the doctor whispered. He tried several more tests. Bright lights shined in the baby's eyes, loud noises near his ears, even a small needle prick on his finger to draw blood. Each time, Silas responded appropriately, turning towards sounds, blinking at lights, pulling his hand away from pain, but he never made a sound. "Doctor." Hartwell spent nearly an hour examining the child, growing more perplexed with each passing minute. By all medical standards, Silas was perfectly healthy. His vocal cords appeared normal, his hearing was clearly functional, and his neurological responses were appropriate for his age. There was simply no medical reason why he shouldn't be able to cry. "I've never encountered anything quite like this," Dr. Hartwell admitted to Whitmore as they stepped outside the cabin. "The child appears to be in perfect health. His vocal apparatus is fully functional, his nervous system is responding normally, and yet he doesn't cry," Whitmore finished. "Precisely. It's as if he has made a conscious decision not to vocalize, which is, of course, impossible for an infant of his age." As they spoke, neither man noticed that Silas had turned his head toward the window, his dark eyes fixed on them through the thin glass. Sarah, still holding her son, felt a shiver run through her as she watched her baby's intense focus on the two white men discussing his fate. Dr. Hartwell returned to his practice in Natchez that evening, but he couldn't stop thinking about the silent child. He consulted his medical texts, wrote letters to colleagues in New Orleans and Charleston, and even reached out to physicians in Europe who might have encountered similar cases. The responses he received were uniformly baffling. No one had ever documented a case of an otherwise healthy infant who simply refused to cry. Over the following weeks, Dr. Hartwell found himself making excuses to return to Magnolia Grove. He told Whitmore he wanted to monitor the child's development, but the truth was that Silas had become an obsession. The doctor had built his reputation on his ability to diagnose and treat any medical condition, and this silent baby represented a challenge to everything he thought he knew about human physiology. During his visits, Dr. Hartwell began to notice other unusual aspects of Silas's behavior. The baby seemed to understand far more than he should at his age. When adults spoke around him, his eyes would track from speaker to speaker as if he were following the conversation. When other children in the quarters cried or played loudly, Silas would turn toward the sounds with what appeared to be genuine interest. But he never attempted to join in or respond vocally. Most disturbing of all was the way Silas seemed to study the people around him. His gaze was too focused, too intelligent for a 3-month-old infant. Dr. Hartwell began to feel as though the baby was examining him just as thoroughly as he was examining the baby. The doctor's visits did not go unnoticed in the slave quarters. The enslaved community had their own theories about Silas's condition, theories that had nothing to do with medical science. Old Mama Ruth, who had delivered the baby, whispered to anyone who would listen that the child had been born with the sight, the ability to see and understand things that others could not. "That baby knows things," she would say, shaking her head. "He sees what's coming, and that's why he don't cry." Ain't no point in crying when you already know how the story ends. Others believed that Silas was a sign, a message from God about the suffering of their people. His silence, they said, represented the voiceless pain of all enslaved people, a living symbol of endurance in the face of unspeakable cruelty. But there were darker whispers too. Some of the older slaves spoke of children born under cursed stars, babies who came into the world carrying the weight of ancient sorrows. They crossed themselves when Silas was near and muttered prayers under their breath. As winter approached, Dr. Hartwell made one final visit to examine Silas. The baby was now 4 months old and had grown considerably, but he remained as silent as ever. During this visit, something happened that would haunt the doctor for the rest of his life. As he was conducting his examination, Silas suddenly reached up and grasped Dr. Hartwell's finger with surprising strength. The baby's dark eyes locked onto the doctor's, and for a moment Dr. Hartwell felt as though he was looking into the depths of an ancient soul. In that instant, he understood with terrifying clarity that whatever was different about this child had nothing to do with medicine or science. Dr. Hartwell left Magnolia Grove that day and never returned. He would later tell colleagues that he had concluded the child's condition was a rare but harmless neurological quirk, but those who knew him well noticed that he never spoke of the case again. The confident, rational man of science had encountered something that challenged the very foundations of his understanding of the world, and it had shaken him to his core. In the quarters, Silas continued to grow in his profound silence, his dark eyes taking in everything around him, his presence casting an ever-deepening shadow over the lives of everyone at Magnolia Grove Plantation. Winter had settled over Magnolia Grove with an unusual harshness. The Mississippi cold seemed to seep into every corner of the plantation, making the already difficult lives of the enslaved people even more challenging. But it wasn't just the weather that had cast a pall over the plantation. It was the growing unease surrounding 6-month-old Silas and his continued absolute silence. Jeremiah Pike had been overseer at Magnolia Grove for 8 years, and in that time he had earned a reputation for his ruthless efficiency and his ability to maintain order through fear and brutality. He was a tall, lean man with pale eyes and a perpetual scowl, and the enslaved workers had learned to scatter when they saw him approaching with his ever-present whip. But lately, Pike found himself avoiding certain areas of the plantation, particularly the section of the quarters where Sarah and her silent baby lived. He told himself it was coincidence, that his rounds simply didn't require him to patrol that area as frequently. But deep down, he knew the truth. The baby unnerved him in a way he couldn't explain or admit. It had started with small things. The way the baby's eyes seemed to follow him when he passed by the cabin, the unnatural stillness that seemed to emanate from the child, as if his very presence absorbed sound and movement from the surrounding area. Pike had noticed that even the other slave children played more quietly when Silas was nearby, their usual laughter and chatter reduced to whispers. The breaking point came on a particularly cold February morning. Pike had been making his rounds, checking on the work assignments for the day, when he heard a commotion coming from the quarters. One of the field hands, a young man named Marcus, had apparently collapsed during the night and was running a high fever. Pike approached the scene with his usual swagger, ready to determine whether the slave was genuinely ill or simply malingering. But as he drew closer, he noticed that Sarah was there with her baby, having come to help tend to the sick man. Silas was cradled in her arms, his dark eyes taking in the scene with that same unsettling awareness that had begun to haunt Pike's dreams. "What's the situation here?" Pike demanded, his voice cutting through the worried murmurs of the gathered slaves. "Marcus took sick in the night, sir," replied an elderly man named Joseph. "Fever's got him bad. Sarah here's been helping tend to him." Pike looked down at Marcus, who was indeed burning with fever and delirious. It was clear the man was genuinely ill, not faking, but as Pike stood there deciding what to do, he became aware of Silas's gaze fixed on him. The baby's eyes seemed to bore into him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "Get him to the sick house," Pike ordered, his voice rougher than usual. "And keep that. Keep the baby away from the sick man. Don't need whatever he's got spreading." As the slaves moved to carry Marcus away, Pike found himself unable to look away from Silas. The baby's expression was calm, almost serene, but there was something in those dark eyes that seemed to see right through Pike's carefully constructed facade of authority and control. For a moment, Pike felt a strange sensation, as if the baby was looking not just at him, but into him, seeing all the cruelty he had inflicted, all the pain he had caused, all the darkness that lived in his heart. It was impossible, of course. A 6-month-old baby couldn't understand such things, but the feeling was so strong, so overwhelming, that Pike took an involuntary step backward. "You," he said to Sarah, his voice shaking slightly, "keep that child in your cabin. I don't want to see him wandering around the quarters." Sarah nodded quickly, clutching Silas closer to her chest. She had noticed the change in Pike's behavior around her son, and while she didn't understand it, she was grateful for anything that might keep the brutal overseer away from them. As Pike walked away, he could feel Silas's eyes on his back, and he had to resist the urge to break into a run. That night, he drank more than usual, trying to wash away the memory of those dark, knowing eyes. The incident marked the beginning of Pike's steady deterioration. Over the following weeks, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He would fly into sudden rages over minor infractions, lashing out with his whip at slaves who had done nothing wrong. Other times, he would stand motionless for long periods, staring off into the distance as if seeing something that wasn't there. The enslaved community began to whisper that Pike was losing his mind, and they weren't entirely wrong. The overseer had become obsessed with Silas, convinced that the baby was somehow responsible for his growing unease and paranoia. He began to have nightmares about those dark eyes, dreams where the silent child grew into a man who stood in judgment over all the cruelties Pike had committed. Master Whitmore noticed the change in his overseer's behavior, but attributed it to the stress of managing the plantation during the difficult winter months. He had no idea that Pike had become fixated on a 6-month-old baby, or that the man's grip on reality was slowly slipping away. The situation came to a head on a grey March morning when Pike encountered Sarah carrying Silas near the cotton fields. The baby was now 7 months old and had grown considerably, but he remained as silent as ever. As Sarah approached, intending to pass by without incident, Pike stepped directly into her path. "Stop right there," he commanded, his voice harsh and strained. Sarah froze, her heart pounding. She could see something wild and dangerous in Pike's pale eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "That baby of yours," Pike said, his gaze fixed on Silas. "There's something wrong with him, something unnatural." "No, sir," Sarah replied quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's just a quiet child, that's all." Pike stepped closer, and Sarah could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Quiet? He's never made a sound, not once. That ain't natural. That ain't right." Silas, as if sensing the tension in the air, turned his head to look directly at Pike. The overseer felt that familiar chill run down his spine as those dark eyes met his. "He's looking at me," Pike whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and rage. "Always looking at me with those eyes, like he knows, like he sees." "Please, sir," Sarah pleaded, backing away slowly. "He's just a baby. He don't mean no harm." But Pike wasn't listening. He was lost in his own paranoid delusions, convinced that this silent child was somehow the source of all his troubles. He raised his hand as if to strike, and Sarah instinctively turned to shield her son. At that moment, something extraordinary happened. Silas, who had never made a sound in his 7 months of life, opened his mouth. But instead of crying or screaming, he simply exhaled, a long, soft breath that seemed to carry with it all the weight of unspoken suffering. The sound, barely audible, had a profound effect on Pike. He stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck, his face pale and his hands shaking. For a moment, he stood there swaying, his eyes wide with terror. Then, without another word, he turned and fled, leaving Sarah and Silas standing alone in the field. That evening, Pike went to Master Whitmore's study, his hat in his hands and his face haggard. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to speak with you about that baby, Sarah's baby." Whitmore looked up from his papers, noting the overseer's disheveled appearance. "What about him?" "There's something wrong with him, sir. Something evil. He's cursing this place, cursing all of us. I can feel it." Whitmore frowned. He had heard rumors about Pike's strange behavior, but this was the first time he had witnessed it firsthand. "Jeremiah, you're talking nonsense. He's just a baby." "No, sir," Pike insisted, his voice growing more agitated. "He's not just a baby. He's something else, something dark. And as long as he's here, this plantation is cursed." Whitmore studied his overseer's face, seeing the genuine fear and desperation there. Pike had always been a hard man, but he had never been prone to flights of fancy or superstition. The fact that he was speaking this way now was deeply troubling. "I think you need some time away from the plantation," Whitmore said carefully. "Perhaps a visit to your sister in Vicksburg would do you good." Pike shook his head violently. "You don't understand, sir. That baby, he sees things, he knows things. And he's waiting. Waiting for what?" Pike's voice dropped to a whisper. "For us to pay for what we've done." The next morning, Jeremiah Pike was found dead in his cabin, apparently having suffered a heart attack during the night. He was only 34 years old and had been in good health. The doctor who examined the body could find no explanation for his sudden death, though he noted that Pike's face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. In the slave quarters, the news of Pike's death was met with a mixture of relief and unease. The brutal overseer was gone, but the circumstances of his death only added to the growing legend surrounding Silas and his mysterious silence. Sarah held her son closer that night, whispering prayers of protection over his silent form. She didn't know what power her child possessed, if any, but she knew that his very existence had somehow brought about the downfall of one of their greatest tormentors. And in his mother's arms, Silas lay quietly, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight, his silence deeper and more profound than ever before. Spring had arrived at Magnolia Grove, bringing with it new growth and the promise of another brutal planting season. But the death of Jeremiah Pike had left the plantation in a state of unease that even the warming weather couldn't dispel. Master Whitmore had quickly hired a new overseer, a man named Thomas Crawford, who came with strong recommendations from a neighboring plantation. However, the whispers about Silas and his connection to Pike's mysterious death continued to spread throughout the quarters and beyond. Word of the silent baby had begun to reach the surrounding communities. Traveling merchants, visiting plantation owners, and even some of the local clergy had heard tales of the child who never cried, and many were curious to see this phenomenon for themselves. It was this curiosity that brought Reverend Ezekiel Thornton to Magnolia Grove on a warm April morning. Reverend Thornton was a man of considerable reputation in the region, known for his fiery sermons and his unwavering belief in the power of divine intervention. He was tall and imposing, with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look directly into a person's soul. He had come to Magnolia Grove ostensibly to minister to the enslaved population, but his true purpose was to investigate the stories he had heard about the silent child. Master Whitmore received the Reverend in his study, offering him refreshments and discussing the spiritual needs of the plantation's enslaved population. But it wasn't long before the conversation turned to the real reason for Thornton's visit. "I've heard some rather extraordinary tales about one of your slaves," Thornton said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a practiced orator. "A child who, it is said, has never uttered a sound since birth." Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The subject of Silas had become increasingly troublesome for him, especially after Pike's death. "Yes, there is such a child. The slaves have theories about his condition, but I assure you it's nothing more than a medical curiosity." "Perhaps," Thornton replied, his eyes gleaming with interest. "But I have found that what appears to be medical often has spiritual roots. I would very much like to meet this child and his mother." Whitmore couldn't refuse a request from such a prominent member of the clergy, so he arranged for Sarah and Silas to be brought to the main house. As they waited, Thornton spoke of his experiences with what he called marked children, babies born with unusual characteristics that he believed indicated divine or demonic influence. "In my years of ministry," he explained, "I have encountered children who seemed to carry the weight of prophecy, others who appeared to be touched by darkness. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Mr. Whitmore, and sometimes he sends us signs that we must learn to interpret." When Sarah arrived with 9-month-old Silas in her arms, Reverend Thornton felt an immediate shift in the atmosphere of the room. The baby, now larger and more alert than ever, turned his dark eyes toward the preacher with that same unsettling directness that had so disturbed Pike. "This is the child?" Thornton asked, rising from his chair and approaching slowly. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She had heard about this white preacher's visit and was terrified of what it might mean for her son. Thornton studied Silas intently, noting the baby's unusual stillness and the intelligence that seemed to shine in his dark eyes. "May I hold him?" Sarah hesitated, but she knew she had no choice. Reluctantly, she handed her son to the Reverend. The moment Silas was in Thornton's arms, the preacher felt something he had never experienced before. It was as if the baby's silence was not merely an absence of sound, but a presence unto itself, a profound quiet that seemed to speak louder than any cry or scream ever could. "Remarkable," Thornton murmured, looking down into Silas's face. "Tell me, child," he said to Sarah, "has he ever shown any response to pain? Any reaction to discomfort?" "He feels things, sir," Sarah replied carefully. "He pulls away from what hurts him, turns toward what pleases him. He just don't make no sound about it." Thornton nodded, his mind racing with theological implications. In his studies of scripture and church doctrine, he had read about children born under special circumstances, babies who came into the world carrying divine messages or supernatural burdens. Could this silent child be such a messenger? "I would like to conduct a small service," Thornton announced, "here, in this room with the child present. I believe the Lord may have something to reveal to us through this unusual circumstance." Whitmore looked uncomfortable but nodded his agreement. He was curious to see what the Reverend might discover, and he hoped that a man of God might be able to provide some rational explanation for the strange events that had been plaguing his plantation. Thornton began to pray, his voice rising and falling in the rhythmic cadence of evangelical fervor. He spoke of divine mysteries, of children chosen by God for special purposes, of signs and wonders that revealed the Lord's will to his faithful servants. As the prayer continued, something extraordinary began to happen. Silas, who had remained perfectly still in the Reverend's arms, began to show signs of agitation for the first time in his life. His breathing quickened, his small hands clenched into fists, and his dark eyes seemed to grow even more intense. "Yes," Thornton said, his voice growing louder and more passionate. "I can feel the spirit moving in this child. There is something here, something powerful and profound." But as the Reverend's prayers grew more fervent, Silas's agitation increased. His face flushed red, his tiny body trembled, and for a moment it seemed as though he might finally break his silence and cry out. Instead, something far more unsettling occurred. The temperature in the room seemed to drop suddenly, and the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows dimmed as if clouds had passed over the sun. The very air seemed to thicken, making it difficult to breathe. Thornton's prayers faltered as he felt an overwhelming sense of presence in the room. Not the divine presence he had been seeking, but something else entirely. Something ancient and sorrowful and infinitely patient. "What?" he began, but his words died in his throat as he looked down at Silas. The baby's eyes had changed somehow, becoming deeper and darker, as if they contained depths that went far beyond the physical world. In that moment, Thornton understood with terrifying clarity that he was not dealing with a simple medical anomaly or even a divine blessing. This child was something else entirely, a being who existed at the intersection of the physical and spiritual worlds, carrying within his small form the accumulated weight of countless unspoken sorrows. The Reverend's hands began to shake as he held Silas, and he felt an overwhelming urge to put the baby down and flee from the room. But he was transfixed by those dark eyes, unable to look away from the ancient wisdom that seemed to peer out from behind them. "Reverend?" Whitmore's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" Thornton blinked, and suddenly the room returned to normal. The temperature rose, the sunlight brightened, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. But the memory of what he had experienced remained, burned into his consciousness like a brand. With trembling hands, he returned Silas to his mother's arms. The baby settled immediately, his expression returning to its usual calm serenity, as if nothing unusual had happened. I need some air," Thornton said, his voice shaky and uncertain. He stumbled toward the door, leaving Sarah and Whitmore staring after him in confusion. Outside, Thornton leaned against the porch railing, his heart pounding and his mind reeling from what he had experienced. In all his years of ministry, he had never encountered anything like the presence he had felt in that room. It wasn't evil, exactly, but it was something far beyond his understanding or ability to categorize. When he finally composed himself enough to return inside, Thornton found that Sarah and Silas had been dismissed and sent back to the quarters. Whitmore was waiting for him with a glass of brandy and a concerned expression. "What happened in there, Reverend?" Whitmore asked. "You looked as though you had seen a ghost." Thornton accepted the brandy gratefully, downing it in one gulp before answering. "That child," he said slowly, "is not what he appears to be." "What do you mean?" "I mean that his silence is not a medical condition or even a divine blessing. It is something else entirely, something that exists beyond our understanding of the natural world." Whitmore frowned. "You're speaking in riddles, Reverend." "What exactly are you trying to say?" Thornton looked out the window toward the slave quarters, where he knew Silas was now resting in his mother's arms. "I'm saying that child carries within him something that predates our understanding of good and evil, of divine and demonic. He is a vessel for something ancient and powerful, and his silence is not an absence, it is a presence." "That's impossible," Whitmore protested. "He's just a baby." "Is he?" Thornton asked, turning to meet Whitmore's gaze. "Have you ever looked into his eyes, truly looked? Have you ever felt the weight of his silence pressing down on you like a physical force?" Whitmore didn't answer, but his expression suggested that he had indeed experienced something similar. Thornton left Magnolia Grove that evening, but not before warning Whitmore to be careful around the child. "Whatever that baby is," he said as he climbed into his carriage, "he is far more than he appears, and I fear that his presence here will bring consequences that none of us can foresee." As the Reverend's carriage disappeared down the plantation road, Whitmore stood on his porch and looked out toward the slave quarters. Somewhere in that collection of ramshackle cabins, a silent baby lay sleeping in his mother's arms, carrying within his small form mysteries that defied explanation and powers that challenged everything Whitmore thought he knew about the world. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the old oak trees that surrounded the plantation house, and for a moment Whitmore could have sworn he heard something in that wind, not a voice exactly, but a presence, ancient and patient and infinitely watchful. He shivered and went inside, but sleep would not come easily that night. Summer had arrived at Magnolia Grove with a vengeance, bringing with it the oppressive heat and humidity that made life on the Mississippi plantation nearly unbearable. The cotton fields stretched endlessly under the blazing sun, and the enslaved workers labored from dawn to dusk in conditions that would have broken lesser souls. But it wasn't just the physical hardships that weighed heavily on the plantation. It was the growing sense that something fundamental had shifted since the arrival of the silent child. Silas was now 1 year old, and his continued silence had become a source of legend throughout the region. Visitors came from as far away as New Orleans and Memphis to see the baby who never cried, and each departure carried with it new stories and theories about his unusual condition. Some claimed he was blessed by God, others whispered that he was cursed by darker forces, but all agreed that there was something profoundly unsettling about the child's absolute quiet. Master Whitmore had grown increasingly troubled by the attention his plantation was receiving. The constant stream of visitors disrupted the normal operations of the estate, and the enslaved workers had become distracted by the endless speculation about Silas. More troubling still were the reports from his new overseer, Thomas Crawford, who claimed that productivity had declined significantly since Pike's death. "It's that baby, sir," Crawford had told Whitmore just that morning. "The slaves are all spooked by him. They whisper about him constantly, and some of them seem almost afraid to work when he's nearby." Crawford was a practical man, less prone to superstition than his predecessor, but even he had to admit that there was something unnerving about the silent child. Unlike Pike, however, Crawford's response was not fear but anger. He saw Silas as a disruptive influence that needed to be controlled, and he had begun to pressure Whitmore to take action. The breaking point came on a sweltering July afternoon when the heat had reached nearly unbearable levels. The enslaved workers were struggling to maintain their pace in the cotton fields, and tempers were running high throughout the plantation. It was on this day that Crawford decided to make an example of Sarah and her son. Sarah had been working in the main house, helping with the laundry and cleaning, while Silas rested in a basket nearby. The baby, now walking and more mobile than ever, had begun to explore his surroundings with the same silent curiosity that had marked his entire life. He would toddle around the quarters, observing everything with those dark, intelligent eyes. But he never made a sound, no babbling, no laughter, no cries of excitement or frustration. Crawford had been watching Sarah work, his pale eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, he approached her as she hung wet clothes on the line behind the main house. "That baby of yours is becoming a problem," he said without preamble, his voice cold and threatening. Sarah's hands stilled on the clothesline. "Sir? Don't play dumb with me, girl. You know what I'm talking about. The other slaves are all worked up about him, talking nonsense about curses and signs. It's affecting their work." "Silas, don't cause no trouble, sir," Sarah replied quietly, not daring to look directly at the overseer. "He's just a quiet child." Crawford stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Quiet? That baby ain't natural, and everyone knows it. He's spooking the other slaves, and that's affecting my ability to maintain order on this plantation." As if sensing the tension in the air, Silas toddled over to his mother, wrapping his small arms around her legs. Crawford looked down at the child with undisguised disgust. "Look at him," Crawford said, "standing there like he understands every word we're saying. That ain't normal for a baby his age." Sarah instinctively moved to shield her son, but Crawford grabbed her arm roughly. "I'm going to make this simple for you. Either you find a way to make that baby cry, prove he's normal, or I'm going to recommend to Master Whitmore that both of you be sold off to a plantation where your peculiarities won't be tolerated." The threat hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah knew that being sold away from Magnolia Grove would likely mean separation from her son, and possibly a fate far worse than anything they had experienced so far. "Please, sir," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He's just a baby. He can't help the way he is." Crawford's grip tightened on her arm. "Then you better find a way to help him, because I'm not going to let one strange baby disrupt the entire operation of this plantation." At that moment, something extraordinary happened. Silas, who had been standing quietly beside his mother, suddenly looked up at Crawford with an expression that was far too mature for his young face. The overseer found himself staring into those dark eyes, and for a moment he felt the same chill that had plagued Pike in his final months. But Crawford was made of sterner stuff than his predecessor. Instead of backing down, he reached out and grabbed Silas by the arm, lifting the toddler off the ground. "Let's see if we can't get some sound out of you," he said, his voice filled with cruel determination. What followed was one of the most disturbing scenes in the history of Magnolia Grove. Crawford, driven by frustration and a need to prove his authority, began to systematically attempt to force Silas to cry. He pinched the child, shook him, even struck him with his open hand. Through it all, Silas remained absolutely silent, his dark eyes fixed on Crawford's face with an intensity that seemed to burn. Sarah screamed and begged, trying to reach her son, but Crawford held her back with one hand while continuing his assault on the child with the other. Other slaves began to gather, drawn by Sarah's cries, but none dared to intervene directly against the white overseer. The scene might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the arrival of Master Whitmore himself, who had heard the commotion from his study. He took in the scene with growing horror, his overseer brutalizing a baby while the child's mother screamed in anguish. "Crawford!" Whitmore shouted. "What in God's name are you doing?" The overseer turned, still holding Silas, his face flushed with exertion and rage. "I'm trying to prove this baby is normal, sir. I'm trying to make him cry like any other child would." Whitmore looked at Silas, who, despite the abuse he had endured, remained completely silent. The baby's face was red from Crawford's strikes, and there were clear marks on his small arms where he had been pinched and grabbed. But his eyes, those dark, knowing eyes, remained calm and focused. "Put the child down," Whitmore ordered, his voice deadly quiet. Crawford hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly set Silas on the ground. The toddler immediately ran to his mother, who scooped him up and held him close, sobbing with relief. "Sir," Crawford began, "I was just trying to—" "You were torturing a baby," Whitmore cut him off, "in front of his mother and half the plantation. What kind of man does such a thing? But sir, the child isn't normal. Look at him. After everything I just did to him, he hasn't made a sound. That's not natural." Whitmore looked at Silas, who was indeed showing no signs of distress despite the abuse he had suffered. The baby's silence in the face of such treatment was indeed unnerving, but Whitmore found himself more disturbed by Crawford's actions than by the child's response. "Pack your things," Whitmore said quietly. "You're no longer welcome on this plantation." Crawford's face went white. "Sir, you can't be serious. I was just trying to maintain order. That baby is a disruptive influence. The only disruptive influence I see here is you," Whitmore replied. "You have 1 hour to gather your belongings and leave my property." As Crawford stalked away, muttering under his breath about ungrateful employers and unnatural children, Whitmore approached Sarah and Silas. The baby looked up at him with those same dark eyes, and for a moment, Whitmore felt as though he was being judged by something far older and wiser than a 1-year-old child. "I'm sorry," Whitmore said quietly, though he wasn't entirely sure whether he was apologizing to Sarah or to Silas himself. That should never have happened. Sarah nodded, still clutching her son protectively. Thank you, sir. Thank you for stopping him. As Whitmore walked back to the main house, he couldn't shake the image of Silas's calm, silent endurance in the face of Crawford's brutality. The child had absorbed pain and violence without making a sound, as if he understood that crying would serve no purpose, that silence was a form of strength rather than weakness. That night, as word of the day's events spread through the slave quarters, the legend of Silas grew even stronger. The enslaved community spoke in hushed tones about the baby who could endure any suffering without breaking, who faced cruelty with a silence that seemed to speak louder than any scream. Some said it was a sign that their people's suffering would not last forever, that God had sent them a child who embodied their strength and endurance. Others whispered that Silas was gathering up all their pain and sorrow, holding it within his small form until the day when justice would finally come. But all agreed on one thing: the silent child was no ordinary baby. He was something more, something that carried within him the weight of their collective experience and the promise of something greater to come. And in his mother's arms, as Sarah sang him a wordless lullaby, Silas lay quietly, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight, his silence deeper and more profound than ever before. The autumn of 1856 brought with it an air of change that seemed to permeate every corner of Magnolia Grove plantation. Silas was now 15 months old, walking steadily and exploring his world with the same silent curiosity that had marked his entire existence. His legend had spread far beyond the boundaries of Mississippi, drawing visitors from across the South who came to witness the child who had never made a sound. Master Whitmore had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the attention his plantation was receiving. The constant stream of visitors, doctors, clergymen, curiosity seekers, and even some who claimed to be scholars of the supernatural, had disrupted the normal operations of the estate. More troubling still was the effect that Silas seemed to have on everyone who encountered him. Some left the plantation deeply moved, speaking of the child as a symbol of endurance and strength. Others departed in a state of profound unease, claiming that the baby's silence was unnatural and disturbing. The enslaved community had developed their own complex relationship with Silas and his mysterious condition. To many, he had become a source of hope, a living symbol that their suffering had not gone unnoticed by higher powers. They spoke of him in whispers, sharing stories of his calm endurance in the face of Crawford's brutality and his apparent immunity to the cruelties that defined their daily existence. But there were others in the quarters who viewed Silas with suspicion and fear. They whispered that his silence was a curse, that his presence brought misfortune to those around him. They pointed to Pike's mysterious death and Crawford's violent behavior as evidence that the child carried with him some dark influence. Sarah found herself caught between these competing interpretations of her son's nature. She loved Silas with a fierce, protective devotion, but she couldn't deny that there was something profoundly different about him. As he grew older, his silence seemed to deepen rather than diminish. He would watch the world around him with those dark, intelligent eyes, taking in everything but never attempting to communicate through sound. The crisis that would define Silas's future began on a cold November morning when a new visitor arrived at Magnolia Grove. Dr. Aldrich Blackwood was a man of considerable reputation in certain circles, a physician and researcher who specialized in what he called anomalous human conditions. He had traveled from Charleston specifically to examine Silas, having heard reports of the child's unusual characteristics. Dr. Blackwood was unlike the other visitors who had come to see Silas. Where others had been content to observe and speculate, Blackwood came with a specific agenda. He believed that Silas represented a unique opportunity to study what he termed developmental aberrations. and he had convinced Master Whitmore to allow him to conduct a series of comprehensive examinations. "I assure you, Mr. Whitmore," Blackwood said as they discussed his proposed research, "my methods are entirely scientific and humane. I simply wish to document this child's condition for the advancement of medical knowledge." Whitmore, who had grown weary of the constant speculation about Silas, saw Blackwood's visit as an opportunity to finally obtain some definitive answers about the child's condition. He agreed to allow the doctor to examine Silas, though he insisted that the child's mother be present during all procedures. The examinations began the following day in a room that Blackwood had converted into a makeshift laboratory. Sarah sat in a corner, holding Silas on her lap, while the doctor conducted a series of tests designed to measure the child's responses to various stimuli. Blackwood was thorough and methodical, testing Silas's hearing, vision, reflexes, and cognitive abilities. What he discovered both fascinated and disturbed him. The child's physical development was completely normal. In fact, he seemed to be slightly advanced for his age in terms of motor skills and apparent intelligence. His hearing was perfect, his vision acute, and his neurological responses were entirely appropriate. But his silence remained absolute and inexplicable. "Remarkable," Blackwood murmured as he completed his initial examinations. "By every measure I can devise, this child should be capable of vocalization, yet he chooses not to speak." "Chooses?" Sarah asked, speaking for the first time since the examinations had begun. Blackwood looked at her with interest. "Oh yes, my dear. This is not a medical condition in the traditional sense. Your son is making a conscious decision to remain silent. The question is why?" Over the following days, Blackwood's examinations became increasingly invasive and disturbing. He subjected Silas to a series of tests designed to provoke vocal responses, loud noises, bright lights, mild electric shocks, and even brief periods of separation from his mother. Through it all, Silas remained completely silent, enduring each test with the same calm composure that had marked his response to Crawford's brutality. But as the examinations continued, something began to change in the atmosphere around the plantation. The enslaved workers reported strange dreams and unexplained feelings of unease. Some claimed to hear whispers in the wind, voices speaking in languages they didn't recognize. Others reported seeing shadows moving in their peripheral vision, shapes that disappeared when they turned to look directly at them. Master Whitmore himself began to experience disturbing phenomena. He would wake in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was watching him, only to find his bedroom empty. During the day, he would catch glimpses of movement in the corners of his vision, but when he turned to investigate, he would see nothing. The breaking point came on the 5th day of Blackwood's examinations. The doctor had become increasingly frustrated by his inability to provoke any vocal response from Silas, and his methods had grown correspondingly more extreme. On this particular morning, he had decided to conduct what he called a stress response test, which involved subjecting the child to increasingly uncomfortable stimuli while monitoring his physiological reactions. Sarah watched in growing horror as Blackwood applied various forms of mild torture to her son: ice water, heated metal objects, sharp pinpricks, and other painful stimuli. Through it all, Silas remained silent, his dark eyes fixed on the doctor's face with an intensity that seemed to burn. "Fascinating," Blackwood muttered, making notes in his journal. "The child's pain tolerance is extraordinary. It's as if he has learned to transcend physical discomfort through sheer." As the torture continued, something began to happen in the room that defied rational explanation. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows dimmed as if storm clouds had gathered overhead. The very air seemed to thicken, making it difficult to breathe. Sarah felt it first, a presence in the room that hadn't been there before. It was as if the accumulated suffering of generations had suddenly manifested, drawn by her son's silent endurance of pain. She looked around frantically, seeing nothing but feeling everything. The weight of countless tears that had never been shed, the echo of screams that had never been voiced, the presence of all those who had suffered in silence. Blackwood, absorbed in his examination, didn't notice the change at first. But as he prepared to apply another painful stimulus to Silas, he suddenly found himself unable to move. His hand, holding a heated metal probe, froze in midair as if gripped by an invisible force. "What?" he began, but his words died in his throat as he looked into Silas's eyes. The child's gaze had changed, becoming deeper and darker than ever before. In those dark depths, Blackwood saw something that made his blood run cold. Not the innocent confusion of a toddler, but the accumulated wisdom and sorrow of ages. It was as if he was looking into the eyes of every enslaved person who had ever lived and died in silence, every soul who had endured unspeakable suffering without the luxury of complaint. The room began to fill with whispers. Not audible sounds, but voices that spoke directly to the mind and heart. They were the voices of the voiceless, the cries of those who had been forced into silence by cruelty and oppression. They spoke of pain endured, of dignity maintained in the face of dehumanization, of strength found in the darkest moments of despair. Blackwood tried to step back, but found himself rooted in place, forced to confront the reality of what he was doing. In Silas's eyes, he saw not a subject for scientific study, but a living repository of human suffering, a child who had somehow become a vessel for all the pain that had been inflicted without consequence, all the tears that had been shed in darkness, all the screams that had been stifled by fear. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Blackwood began to understand that he was not just examining a child, he was standing in judgment before something far greater and more terrible than he had ever imagined. The accumulated weight of centuries of injustice pressed down on him, and he felt his sanity beginning to crack under the pressure. "Stop," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please, stop." But the presence in the room was not finished with him. Through Silas's eyes, Blackwood was forced to witness the true horror of what he and others like him had done. The casual cruelty, the dehumanization, the reduction of human beings to property to be studied and experimented upon. He saw himself as he truly was, not a man of science, but a torturer hiding behind the facade of research. The metal probe fell from his nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through eternity. Blackwood stumbled backward, his face pale and his hands shaking uncontrollably. I can't," he stammered, his carefully constructed composure crumbling completely. This isn't natural." Sarah, still holding Silas, watched as the doctor fled from the room, leaving behind his instruments and his notes in his desperate haste to escape. The presence that had filled the room began to fade, the temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. But the silence that remained was different now, deeper and more profound than ever before. It was no longer just the absence of sound, but the presence of something far more powerful. It was the silence of accumulated strength, of endurance beyond human understanding, of a spirit that could not be broken no matter what cruelties were inflicted upon it. Master Whitmore found Blackwood in his study an hour later, packing his belongings with frantic haste. The doctor's hands were still shaking, and his face was ashen with terror. "Leaving so soon, Doctor?" Whitmore asked, though he could see that something had profoundly disturbed his guest. "That child," Blackwood said without looking up from his packing. He's not what we thought he was." "What do you mean?" Blackwood finally met Whitmore's gaze, and the plantation owner was shocked by the fear he saw in the doctor's eyes. "He's not just a child with an unusual medical condition. He's something else entirely, a vessel for something ancient and powerful, something that judges us for our actions." "That's ridiculous," Whitmore protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Blackwood asked, his voice rising with hysteria. "Have you looked into his eyes, truly looked? Have you felt the weight of his silence pressing down on you like the judgment of God himself?" Whitmore didn't answer, but his expression suggested that he had indeed experienced something similar. Blackwood finished his packing and headed for the door, but he paused on the threshold. "That child carries within him the accumulated suffering of his people," he said quietly. "And one day that suffering will demand an accounting. Mark my words, Mr. Whitmore, the silence will not last forever." As Blackwood's carriage disappeared down the plantation road, Whitmore stood on his porch and looked out toward the slave quarters. Somewhere in that collection of humble cabins, a silent child sat in his mother's arms, carrying within his small form mysteries that defied explanation and powers that challenged everything Whitmore thought he knew about justice and retribution. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the old oak trees, and for a moment Whitmore could have sworn he heard something in that wind, not voices exactly, but the echo of all the words that had never been spoken, all the cries that had never been heard, all the prayers that had been offered up in desperate silence. He shivered and went inside, but he knew that sleep would not come easily that night, or any night thereafter. The reckoning had begun, and there was no escaping the judgment that was to come. Winter had settled over Magnolia Grove with an unusual severity, as if the very earth was holding its breath in anticipation of something momentous. Silas was now 18 months old, and the events surrounding Dr. Blackwood's hasty departure had only added to his growing legend. Word had spread throughout the region about the doctor's terrified flight from the plantation, and with it came new theories about the nature of the silent child. Master Whitmore had aged considerably in the months following Blackwood's visit. The confident, pragmatic plantation owner had been replaced by a man haunted by doubts and fears he couldn't name. He found himself avoiding the slave quarters entirely, unable to bear the thought of encountering Silas and those dark, knowing eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. The enslaved community had noticed the change in their master, and they understood its significance. The white man, who had once seemed so powerful and untouchable, was now afraid of a baby who had never spoken a word. It was a shift in the natural order that gave them hope, even as it filled them with a sense of impending change. Sarah had watched her son grow with a mixture of pride and trepidation. Silas was developing normally in every way except for his continued silence. He walked confidently now, explored his surroundings with intelligent curiosity, and seemed to understand everything that was said to him. But he had never attempted to speak, never made any sound beyond the soft whisper of his breathing. What troubled Sarah most was the way other people reacted to her son. Adults would fall silent in his presence, children would stop their play to stare at him, and even the plantation's animals seemed to sense something different about him. Dogs would whimper and back away when he approached. Horses would become skittish, and even the birds seemed to quiet their songs when he was near. The crisis that would define the final chapter of Silas's time at Magnolia Grove began on a cold February morning in 1857. A group of slave catchers had arrived at the plantation, pursuing a family of escaped slaves who were believed to be hiding in the area. These men were among the most brutal and feared individuals in the South, known for their ruthless efficiency and their complete lack of mercy. Their leader was a man named Caleb Morrison, a tall, scarred individual with cold gray eyes and a reputation for violence that preceded him wherever he went. Morrison had been tracking escaped slaves for over a decade, and he took a perverse pride in his ability to break the spirit of anyone he captured. Master Whitmore received the slave catchers in his study, offering them the hospitality that was customary when dealing with such men. But he was uncomfortable with their presence, particularly given the strange atmosphere that had settled over his plantation in recent months. "We have reason to believe that a family of runaways passed through this area," Morrison explained, his voice carrying the flat, emotionless tone of a man accustomed to violence. A man, his wife, and their 2 children. They escaped from the Beauregard plantation 3 days ago. I haven't seen any strangers on my property, Whitmore replied, though he made no effort to hide his distaste for Morrison and his men. With your permission, we'd like to search the slave quarters, Morrison said. Sometimes runaways will hide among other slaves, hoping to blend in until the search passes. Whitmore nodded reluctantly. He knew he had no choice but to cooperate with the slave catchers, regardless of his personal feelings about their methods. The search began immediately, with Morrison and his men moving through the quarters like a plague of locusts. They overturned belongings, questioned the enslaved workers harshly, and generally created an atmosphere of terror and intimidation. It was during this search that Morrison first encountered Silas. Sarah was in her cabin, holding her son close and trying to keep him calm despite the chaos outside. When Morrison kicked open her door and stepped inside, she instinctively moved to shield Silas from view. "What have we here?" Morrison asked, his cold eyes taking in the scene. "A woman and her baby, hiding in the shadows." "We ain't hiding, sir," Sarah replied quietly. "This is our home." Morrison stepped closer, and as he did, his gaze fell on Silas. The child looked up at him with those same dark, intelligent eyes that had unsettled so many others, and Morrison felt an immediate and inexplicable sense of unease. "Strange-looking baby," Morrison commented, his voice carrying a note of suspicion. "How old is he?" 18 months, sir." Morrison frowned. In his experience, children that age were usually noisy and active, but this baby was perfectly still and silent. "Why isn't he making any noise?" "Most babies cry when strangers come around." "He's just a quiet child, sir," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison's eyes narrowed. There was something about this baby that bothered him, something that set off every instinct he had developed during his years of hunting human beings. He had learned to trust those instincts, and they were telling him that there was more to this situation than met the eye. "Let me see him," Morrison demanded, reaching for Silas. Sarah hesitated, but she knew she had no choice. Reluctantly, she allowed Morrison to take her son from her arms. The moment Morrison held Silas, he felt the same overwhelming presence that had terrified Dr. Blackwood and driven Reverend Thornton to flee. It was as if the baby's silence was not empty space, but a void, filled with something ancient and terrible, the accumulated weight of centuries of suffering and injustice. Morrison was not a man easily intimidated, but as he looked into Silas's eyes, he felt something he had never experienced before, genuine fear. It was as if the baby could see into his soul, could witness every cruel act he had committed, every life he had destroyed in his pursuit of escaped slaves. "What's wrong with this baby?" Morrison asked, his voice rougher than usual. "Nothing's wrong with him, sir," Sarah replied. "He's just different." Morrison continued to stare into Silas's eyes, and as he did, he began to see things, images that flashed through his mind like lightning. He saw the faces of all the people he had captured and returned to slavery, heard their screams and pleas for mercy, felt the weight of their despair settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. But more than that, he began to understand that his actions had consequences beyond the immediate suffering he inflicted. Every person he captured, every family he destroyed, every dream he crushed, added to a growing debt that would eventually demand payment. "This isn't natural," Morrison whispered, his hands beginning to shake as he held the silent child. "This baby, he's not right." As if responding to Morrison's words, Silas did something he had never done before. He reached up with one small hand and touched the slave catcher's scarred cheek. The contact was gentle, almost tender, but Morrison recoiled as if he had been burned. In that moment of contact, Morrison experienced something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He felt with overwhelming clarity the pain and suffering of every person he had ever harmed. He experienced their fear, their desperation, their anguish as if it were his own. And through it all, he heard a voice, not audible but speaking directly to his consciousness, asking a simple question: was it worth it? Morrison stumbled backward, nearly dropping Silas in his haste to get away from the child. His face was pale, and his breathing was labored, as if he had just run a great distance. "Take him," he said to Sarah, his voice shaking. "Take him, and keep him away from me." Sarah quickly reclaimed her son, holding him protectively against her chest. Silas settled immediately, his expression returning to its usual calm serenity, as if nothing unusual had happened. Morrison backed toward the door, his eyes never leaving Silas's face. "That baby," he said to Sarah, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and awe. "He's not just different, he's something else entirely." The slave catcher fled from the cabin, leaving Sarah and Silas alone. Outside, Morrison's men could hear him shouting orders to pack up and leave immediately. The search for the escaped slaves was abandoned, and within an hour, the entire group had departed Magnolia Grove as if pursued by demons. Word of Morrison's terrified flight spread quickly through the slave quarters and beyond. The story grew with each telling, how the most feared slave catcher in Mississippi had been reduced to a trembling, broken man by a single touch from the silent baby. Master Whitmore heard the story and felt a chill run down his spine. He had witnessed the effect that Silas had on others, but Morrison's reaction was the most extreme yet. It was becoming clear that the child's influence was growing stronger, and Whitmore began to fear what might happen if that influence continued to spread. In the weeks that followed Morrison's visit, strange reports began to filter in from across the region. Slave owners spoke of unusual incidents on their plantations. Overseers who suddenly quit their positions, slave catchers who refused certain assignments, and even some masters who began to question the morality of their actions. The common thread in all these reports was the mention of a silent child whose very presence seemed to awaken something in people. A conscience that had long been suppressed, a recognition of the humanity they had been denying in others. As spring arrived at Magnolia Grove, it became clear that Silas's time on the plantation was drawing to a close. Master Whitmore, driven by fear and a growing sense of unease, began to make inquiries about selling the child and his mother to a plantation far from Mississippi. But Sarah had begun to understand that her son's destiny lay elsewhere. The signs were all around her. The way people reacted to Silas, the changes his presence seemed to inspire, the growing legend that surrounded his name. She knew that he was meant for something greater than a life of slavery, something that would honor the silence he had maintained and the suffering he had witnessed. On a warm April evening, as Sarah sat with Silas on the porch of their cabin, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She would take her son and leave Magnolia Grove, not as escaped slaves, but as free people claiming their rightful place in the world. "Your silence has been your strength, baby," she whispered to Silas as she held him close. "But one day, when the time is right, you're going to find your voice. And when you do, the whole world is going to listen." Silas looked up at his mother with those dark, knowing eyes, and for the first time in his life, Sarah thought she saw something new in their depths, not just the accumulated wisdom of suffering, but the promise of hope, the possibility of change, and the quiet strength that would one day transform the world. The legacy of the silent child was just beginning, and though his voice had never been heard, His message was already spreading across the South like wildfire. In a world built on the denial of human dignity, Silas had become a living reminder that some truths could not be silenced, some spirits could not be broken, and some debts would eventually demand payment. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky above Magnolia Grove, Sarah began to plan their escape, knowing that her son's true purpose lay not in the cotton fields of Mississippi, but in a future where his silence would finally give way to a voice that would speak for all those who had been forced to suffer in quiet desperation. The boy who never cried was about to become the man who would change everything, and his journey was just beginning.